Well, hello again from my office in the country. Today we're going to talk about political parties, interest groups, and the electorate, and how that influences decision making, influences the political process, influences what does and doesn't get done in government. And we're going to talk about three specific works that I think are critical to the understanding we want to have on these issues. The first is Federalist Number 10 by James Madison. In my opinion, it needs to be required reading for anybody in political science, anybody studying American government, and for that matter, anybody studying a civics class. It's a brilliant assessment of factions or interest groups. It talks about a debate in the formation between a republic and a democracy, which we won't get into at this point, but it shows the insightfulness that the Founding Fathers had in discussing these major issues and moving forward. The second is a somewhat recent 10-year-old Supreme Court decision on Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. And basically what that did is institutionalize the notion that money is speech, and with very few exceptions, spend what you want to support what you want, and the limitations come to do with donations to particular candidates. And the growth of money around politics has made the challenge even more important as to how everybody gets heard in the process. The third is probably a 20-year-old or so, 30-year-old article by Anthony Downs calling the ups and downs of ecology the issue attention cycle. And it talks about the short-sightedness of most Americans and how our involvement in most movements tend to be very cyclical. And there's a pattern that follows, and I think there's enough recent evidence to suggest that this is really the case and is getting to be more and more an issue and a concern. So all of these will move forward to the questions that we have for this week that deal with what impact is money going to have, or what impact does money have on this idea of the competition between interests, a competition of ideas, the ability of each person to speak out in favor or opposed to the policies they prefer, when in fact the amount of money available is not equally distributed across all interest groups and all interests. So Federalist Number 10 has that famous quote that the unequal distribution of wealth is the greatest source of factions in this country. And Madison has a very detailed instruction for all of us as to why there are factions or interest groups, as we call them today. And he says mankind, by the fact that they're rational thinking beings, will in fact form interests, and they will support the things in which they believe. And that could be a very general interest, as in I support the environment. A very specific issue is I oppose or support pipeline construction. It may be single issues, such as the Natural Rifle Association and its stance on gun control and the right to bear arms. So we join associations for all kinds of reasons. Some we do because it's politically expedient. We're building a resume, if you will, so being part of certain groups is important to do. Others we join just because of a general interest, such as American Association of Retired People, professional associations, organizations, the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. All of those things are interests that form together, and whether they petition government for redress of injury, which is guaranteed all of us in the Constitution, they're still an interest group, an organized interest of people with similar issues and ideas. And for Madison, the question becomes, well, how do we control interests? And how do we control those factions so that there's competition in this arena where all ideas, issues get heard so that people can make rational choices? And so he said there are a couple ways we can do that. And again, Federalist 10 is so instructive in most of these ways. His notion is we can either give everybody to make sure they have the same idea, which doesn't say much for democracy, or we can deny people the right to express opinions, which again is not what we want to do in this country. So the challenge becomes, how do we then have this competition of ideas so that faction competes against faction for the public interest and public support? That's the basics of what he talks about. There's much more in Federalist 10 to read and pay attention to, because he has a very reasoned discussion as to why people form interest and the challenges that interest will have on a political system, and then leads in his discussion of a republic versus a democracy as our form of government. Again, a very powerful Federalist paper number 10. I would encourage you to read it more than once. And again, in any list of Federalist papers that should be read, Federalist 10 should be high on the list because of its discussion of factions and the role that they play. The second document is The Ups and Downs of Ecology by Anthony Downs. And in this study of ecology, he found out that people get fired up about an interest. And they protest, they join movements, they march, they petition their elected officials, they do everything they can to draw attention to this idea or issue that they have. Then according to the cycle, once they've drawn attention and the public officials say, yes, we need to do something about this, for the most part, the interest reigns. The public tends to believe, well, we've done our part. It's now up to the political process. And if they step away from the process, it's easy for those ideas to die in the absence of mass support for it. There's a great risk in a politician moving forward on an issue of any kind if there's not a massive support group behind him or her in making that happen. So this interest then wanes, and whether something happens or not is completely up to the whims of the political process. And in recent history, probably one of the best examples has to do with the mass shootings. And anytime there's a mass shooting, a lot of casualties, what do you hear? An outcry that we need to have what? Gun control. We need to limit the access of weapons to people who do crazy things. And the politicians get involved. Yes, we need to have conversation, we need to talk, we need to change rules, we need to change these things that happen. And when that happens, how much then publicity goes away from the issue because it's now in political hands? And what's been done about that violence over the last 6 or 8 years? Now, this is not a political statement as in taking sides. Rather, it's a reflection of this issue attention cycle at work, where an issue comes along, people get interested, fired up, involved, move with it, demand action to be taken by their government officials, and once government says, yes, we'll deal with it, they kind of feel, well, my job here is done and move on to other things. On a contemporary issue, the challenge will then become, well, what's going to happen with the Black Lives Matter movement? A lot of protests, a lot of demand for action. We've seen this for 20 years in this country. But the fifth fact of the matter is that unless there's sustained support for changing the political process, getting other political leaders involved, being active at the polls, taking other steps to ensure that their voice is heard and is in fact translated into action, will be what happens after today, what happens after the marches and the publicities and the taking over and the discussion. Will this continue through the election cycle? Or will it be like another issue that people get interested in, get enthusiastic about, and then move away from it? As with most issues, for those of you who passionately support that particular issue, it's a challenge for all of you to stay interested, stay committed, and don't just take the process at its word, well, we have it now, we'll deal with it. But stay involved, stay committed, and make sure the actions are taken that you feel are best to solve the issues that are being raised. The third is a Supreme Court case, and I'll say often, and it's true in so many cases, if you really want a good sense of America and American government and the evolution of America and American government, read Supreme Court decisions. As I'll say oftentimes, they're not often the most exciting things to read, but their insight into the process of politics, into the rule of law, into their understanding of the issues relevant to that particular case are incredibly insightful. And it gets to be an important resource. So I would encourage you, to the extent that you have that interest, is to spend time reading those cases. And as a matter of fact, I'll be posting a recent Supreme Court case on presidential immunity later this week, which will be a resource for you to answer a question on the presidency and what goes on. And again, most of these resources I'm mentioning have been available as bookmarks or as actual handouts through Wolf Den, so make sure you check those things. Anyway, the third is the Supreme Court case of Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. And that had to do with the ability of a independent interest group to market a video that was not particularly compromising of Hillary Clinton. The challenge was that violate federal election law in terms of spending. And through the evolution of a number of cases that are cited in the decision, the Supreme Court in effect ruled that money is speech, that to limit a person using the resources they have to support or support their ideas is unconstitutional. It violates its freedom of speech. And where they can put limitations in place has to do with the election process, donating to specific candidates, donating to particular parties. So you see as an outgrowth of this the influx of money with political action committees and super PACs and all of these funding organizations that, as long as they don't have direct ties to a candidate or a political party in some cases, they can spend unlimited amounts of money. Access to who their donor lists are somewhat limited. And that ability to influence, therefore, the outcome of an election is critical. And right now you see it with the massive amounts of money being spent on presidential campaigns. You see an increase in the cost in some areas of running for Senate and House. You'll also see the increase of money in governor's elections across the country. And the challenge, well, a lot of their money comes from out-of-state sources. Again, those people supporting and political action committees, things of that nature, can significantly influence. We'll take these three pieces together, and that ties back into the writings of V.O. Key that are also in. And the two questions that are raised by V.O. Key is, what's the American voter look like in terms of their rationality and their decision-making on who they're going to vote? And to what extent do we have changes in political attitudes that are reflected through different election cycles, which he then calls critical elections? A colleague of mine at the College of Charleston had what he called the flat tire theory of voting behavior. And in that theory, he suggests that we come up with a rational person for whom we're going to vote. And we go to the polls, and on the way to the poll, we get a flat tire. And we jump out, see the flat tire, and we get mad at the labor union worker that put this cruddy tire on in the first place and decide to vote Republican. Or we get mad at the company for putting on cheap tire in the first place and blame the businesses, so we vote Democrat. Or we say to heck with it and go home. Well, the V.O. Key came out of a time when there was a debate over what does the American voter look like, and it comes over to the notion of rationality. Is rationality a thought process, or is it simply a method or process for simplifying decisions? So if you think rationality, and the myth of rational decision-making says, we have the question, we gather the information, we look at alternatives, and then we make the best choice available from alternatives. The challenge, of course, with that view is there's never unlimited access to information, there's never unlimited time, and there are never unlimited resources available to help you move forward. So what Key suggests in his Rational Voter article is that, in fact, we are rational to the extent that we look for cues to make simplified decision rules. And so, for instance, instead of looking at the broad scope of a candidate's policies, we pick one or two issues that are important to us, and if they support those issues, we support that candidate. And as the issues get to be more complex, as the influence of money becomes more confusing in a lot of ways of what really is a candidate, what is their position, in the rise of negative campaigning, where you don't so much advocate the resources and benefits and competence of your candidate, you denigrate the opposition candidate in terms of saying, well, they're lousy and horrible and they're not really this or that, as opposed to talking about the issues that get brought up during the election process. So again, a very broad discussion on those three topics, Federalist 10, Issue Attention Cycle, and Citizens United. And we'll throw into V.O. Key and his discussion of the American voter and the electorate. So that then raises the questions we have. The Founding Fathers and the guarantee in the Constitution says we have the right to petition government for redress of injuries. So all of us have a right to contact our congressman, our senator, our governor, our president, our county council, city council members, and say, hey, this is a problem, we want you to do something about it. But if money is an issue, how equal is the voice that everyone has? Can there really be a competition of ideas? Ted Loy, in his, again, excellent book on the end of liberalism, suggests that government is biased in favor of the organized. So having the appearance of organization goes a long way to giving you credibility. So there are all these factors that get involved. But the key point that I ask you to discuss in the essay question for this week is, given that interests are going to exist, given that different opinions are going to exist, given that we have the right of petition, what impact does the issue attention cycle have on the ability of the mass public to get things done? And second, what is the impact of this unlimited monies that are available specifically to campaigns, but information campaigns can be run throughout communities on different issues. When there's a big environmental concern, the money that's being spent to support one side or the other get to be an important question. So as you look forward, it asks about what role will money have in either enhancing or limiting the ability for there to be this competition of ideas in what's called the marketplace of ideas. And how do we get these things to take place and happen? How do we have that right to petition? And does money then change the size of our megaphone and our ability to be heard? So I hope this helps. Go back and reread those articles, and I have several resources posted on Wolfden. Have a look, see if you have questions, email me or talk to me during office hours, and we will make these things happen. So have a blessed day. Bye-bye now.